Mujib is doing an interview. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you again for being here. This is our final session, and the format is a little bit different. This will be more of a discussion with scholars and among scholars. What we have here will be two panels. Each panel will have 7 scholars who have been participants and submitted their papers. My colleague here, Dr. Heba, Raouf, Ezzat, will also be questioning and conversing with the scholars. What we'll do is that each segment will be 10 minutes for 7 segments. And we'll start with one scholar, ask him a question, try to get a response for about 3 minutes or so. And then we'll continue that discussion for about 10 minutes. After that, any scholar who would like to jump in, feel free to do that for about a minute. And we will try to ask the questions as much as possible related to the topics of this conference. We would also like to know about what they are doing in their respective fields professionally, especially if it is related to our work. Having said that, I'd like to start with Jonathan, Dr. Brown. You're a scholar of Islam, and you've been living in the United States and watching what's happening, especially the deterioration in civil rights. Also, you mentioned in your talk the Iran report, which basically is trying to look at Muslims at different levels, conservative, moderate to progressive, secular, and so on and so forth. Now we've been observing this situation for about a decade, and you see what's happening within the Muslim community. What do you think the Muslim community should do to face up to these challenges, some of them coming directly from the government and from the atmosphere of fear, and some of them coming also from the media and the different parts of society, and some of them from within themselves, because they're trying also to put limits on themselves. How do you assess the situation? Yeah, got microphone. Yeah, yes.
Assalamu alaikum. That's a big question. How long do I have to answer?
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay. It's hard. It's also like very American-specific question. I kind of feel bad if people aren't interested, but
because it has application to other societies.
Yeah. Okay. I think that Joseph and I were talking about this yesterday. The war on terror and kind of the latest assault on Muslim civil liberties and civil liberties in general, kind of national security assault on civil liberties, and began after 9/11. This was started by President Bush, but it was really cemented by President Obama. And a lot of the kind of experiments about arrest, about entrapment, about thought crimes, about arresting people for their political views or their written expressions. These are sort of investigated a little bit and probed by the Bush administration, but they received not only sanction from legislation, but also from the Supreme Court in the United States during the presidency of Barack Obama. So in a way, a lot of those legal fights were sort of, I think, lost. There was not a lot of ground to challenge the government anymore in terms of arresting people for entrapment cases or for written expression, or what's called that written expression could be considered material support for terrorism and things like that. Of course, what happened under Donald Trump's election is that Muslims also became sort of a fan favorite, right, of people who are, anybody who opposes Trump is going to try and find a Muslim to stand next to them, and a hijabi woman, and sort of Muslim causes become sort of celebrity causes of the day. So that's taken a bit of heat off the Muslim community, but it's only superficial because, of course, underneath this, the same things are happening. Arrests of young Muslim men who are essentially...
What do you think we should do? They should do?
Who are trapped? I mean, I think that... I mean, I think it sounds kind of cheesy to say as an American, but I mean, one of the reasons I like being American is because, as far as I know, it's just about being committed to a set of rights and a society that protects those rights and protects people's rights to live, in freedom. What Muslims always should have done, and what they're doing a lot more now, is just committing themselves to the fight for civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of movement. And now that's much more popular because sort of all these leftist groups and progressive groups are rallying against Donald Trump. And so you actually have maybe like more momentum and more social acceptance of this, whereas under Obama it was harder because no one wanted to come on and accuse Barack Obama of undermining civil liberties. But of course he did a lot, but you couldn't make that. When you said that publicly, no Democrat or anybody on the left side of the political spectrum would support you. Now there's a lot more support. So I think, but the problem is some Muslims in the U.S., I think it's a minority, certainly a minority of the Muslim leadership, they are more kind of going on the, we want to be with the right wing, we want to be the conservatives because they're socially conservative and we're socially conservative and they're religious and we're religious. But the fact is, and I've said this and many other people have said this ad nauseum, is that Muslims are just as monstrous to those conservative Christians in the U.S. as, whatever other, whether it's LGBT groups or, what are the other people they don't like? I don't know. Blacks, yeah, minorities, right? I mean, Muslims we're just as grotesque to them as these other groups are. So the idea that somehow we're in this like Abrahamic alliance with them is just complete horseradish. And, that the best future for Muslims in America is also the best future for everybody in America, which is a society that really recognizes the rights of different groups of people to live according to their own beliefs, their own morality, and to have a national government or sort of a legal regime which is very minimalist in what it forces upon people or requires from people. I mean, that, I think, is a demographic future of the U.S. and hopefully the legal future.
Hafsa, do you want to comment? Do you see this part of colonizing Muslim minds there? How do you see it?
So I actually differ a bit with Dr. Brown that I don't think this is just a U.S.-centric conversation. I think this is happening internationally. There's a sort of a global nexus to depoliticize Muslims, reform Islam from within. And you see this kind of playing out in this broader, like UAE, Saudi, the United States, maybe some other countries, Egypt, that are involved. Israel, of course, Israel is also central to it. India now as well. So there is this broader project at work, and there's so much money that's being put into it. I don't even think we know the extent to which this is happening. It's happening in the realm of culture. It's happening in the realm of even entrepreneurship. I mean, there are programs out there sponsored by the UAE that are called hackathons or like Muslim entrepreneurial competitions to counter violence extremism, which is pretty bizarre. And I think because of the amount of money and institutional support given to this reform project, it needs to be countered with as much, if not more, money and institutional support from organizations that are willing to host conferences like these, which are very critical, are willing to bring young people together. So it's going to take a lot of work. It's dangerous work because we're working against some of the worst forms of empire. People will have to sacrifice considerably for it. But fundamentally, Islam is at stake here. That's what's important to consider.
We have two microphones on this side, two microphones on that side.
Thank you. I just want to give a historical perspective on this because in the U.S., I'm sorry?
In 1 minute.
In 1 minute, yes. Just to say that the Muslims aren't the first group of Americans that have been targeted by the state. Historically, of course, during World War I, German Americans were targeted because the U.S. was at war with Germany. At that time, the anti-German sentiment was such that people would stop drinking beer, for example, because it was considered German. They would shoot dachshunds as German dogs on the streets. During World War II, of course, Japanese Americans became a target and were put in detention camps. There are other, of course, groups such as Russian Americans who always supported American anti-Soviet policies, or Chinese Americans after the Chinese Revolution would also be seen as anti-Chinese, or Cuban Americans, etc. So the problem, so you have different kinds of communities that the U.S. either had been at war with their native countries or from which they came, or at peace, or at peace with them, and therefore they're sort of on the good side of things. So in that sense, what is happening to Muslim Americans actually is, of course, parallel to what happened to Japanese Americans and earlier on, and less so to German Americans. But at the same time, the problem today is the attempt by the U.S. to racialize Muslims. Muslims in the U.S. come from all the continents of the world. There are Asian Muslims, African Muslims, even Latin American Muslims, European Muslims. And in that sense, the attempt to racialize them as a category is ongoing, despite the different geographic origins of all of them. And of course, the race question is the most important question in the U.S. This is a highly racialized country where everyone must belong to a race. So the attempt to racialize Muslims, I think, is the ongoing attempt to sort of place them in a certain category. And I do agree the kinds of Muslims that help speak against Muslim countries are the ones that are considered good Muslims.
The last person in that segment, Abdullah, do you have anything about American exceptionalism and the role of Muslims?
Sure. I mean, I think Professor Mas'ad raised a very important point, which is to not exceptionalize the American experience. And I think that this is a trap that a lot of American Muslim institutions can fall into quite often, is that when they're calling on the restoration or, let's say, the preservation of these sort of high ideals, the ones that Dr. Brown mentioned at the beginning, that there's a sense that these things have always existed as part of the American, fabric of American democracy. And of course, as we know, there is this long history in which these ideals have always been stated, but almost never really lived up to, or actually, professed, but not actually observed or practiced. And this goes back to the very founding of the country. A lot of the things that we heard today, I think, really speak to that. The idea that it began as a settler colony that was premised largely on the eradication of native populations, and then, of course, the enslavement of Africans, and then, of course, going into this 20th century history. And so there's a tendency, I think, on the part of Muslims, especially as the kind of recent arrivals, as an immigrant community largely that comes in the latter half of the 20th century, to kind of overlook that history and not really tie themselves as part of the fabric of that history, as opposed to saying the United States has this wonderful document, this Constitution and Bill of Rights that it should uphold, without actually acknowledging that history and also the history of the struggles against those things. And I think that the struggle has to weave itself as part of that broader struggle that's always kind of existed among oppressed groups throughout the country's history. And so in that sense, I think American exceptionalism and then American Muslim exceptionalism, which of course now has also presented itself, I think, in the example that Professor Kanjwar mentioned, as far as the ways in which American Muslims are now being seen as the sort of the bright light unto these other Muslim communities around the world, because they've touched the light of enlightenment in American democracy and so forth. And there is a kind of a temptation to fall into that trap as well, to become these ambassadors, to accept these invitations, to go on speaking tours across Muslim societies in Africa and in the Middle East and Southeast Asia and elsewhere as kind of representatives of
Thank you very much, Professor.
I would like to maybe tackle a topic that is related to the Muslim community in the United States, and then move to Farid Ishaq, maybe to Africa, which is the issue of leadership. Do you think that Muslim communities do have sort of the right representatives to speak for their causes as Muslims, but also as Americans? And then I will move to Ishaq when I get some responses from you. Yeah,
Izzat is dying to answer that question.
Okay, you can. Please. I wanted to ask you a few other questions.
Okay, now I must be very careful now. First of all, I always refer to the United States. I never refer to America. I just think it's extremely arrogant and presumptuous to name one country and to, after two continents. It's like saying South Africa and referring to Africa. Okay. The second thing is this, that, and this is a very painful thing to say, but if there is one country where I do not wish to see Islam spread, then it is the United States of America. I hate the idea of Islam spreading in the United States of America. Because on the whole, United States Muslims have internalized all the hegemonic impulses and arrogances of the empire.
That's not true.
I said on the whole. And especially the white American, the white United States Muslims who are into classical Islam and hadith, okay? Especially those types. So I think the challenge for those Muslims who live in that country is to understand that the fundamental character of the state is that of being an empire, and that they are citizens of the empire. Theologically speaking, not a single prophet came into the world and asked, how do I fit in with power? And this is the dominant question of Muslims in that country. How do we gain acceptability? How do I get an invite to the White House? Prophets don't ask, how do I fit in with power? Prophets ask, how do I challenge power? And if I get into power, how do I use it to transform? So in some ways, it's a profoundly heretical question to ask, how do I fit in with power, which is the question that most Muslims in the United States are obsessed with. And so the priority must be the end. Now, I understand that last year you had one or two speakers who were really embarrassing and completely out of sync with the rest of the conference and so on. So if I may be in my last moment be completely out of sync with this conference, I think that the answer must be that, that I want to work towards the end of this state. No state that is this large and powerful and big and so on can possibly play another role. So people must abandon the idea of this state and work towards the breaking up of this state. And then they can begin to ask, what do we do as Muslims in solidarity with other marginalized communities inside it and outside it?
Okay, can I take the passion to South Africa?
Yes.
There has been news lately that there are attempts to sort of reclaim land and wealth by black Africans, by original Africans of South Africa, claiming that the other citizens who do not belong to the black majority do not have the right to that wealth and land, and maybe repeat the experience of Zimbabwe in a way. And how do you see this affecting the role of Muslims in South Africa that have played an important role in the fight against apartheid, but also at a moment when new generations have forgotten the struggle, and there are a lot of news about South African-Israeli relations being developed at the moment?
Well, first of all, Muslims have played, and we're grateful for that, a very important role in our country's liberation struggle. But you play a role in a liberation struggle not because لا نريد منكم جزاء ولا شكورا, not because you're being promised something in the future. You play a role in a liberation struggle because this is your prophetic, your conscience responsibility, Whether you're going to win or lose, or success or failure, that's, sorry, I'm speaking very much like a theologian now, which I am. That's in the hands of God. So you don't participate in the liberation struggle because you're going to get anything afterwards. Muslims are an intrinsic part of the South African population. Most of them are based in the suburbs. Some of them are very wealthy, some of them are very poor. And the land question in some ways doesn't really affect people who live inside the cities. There it's much more a question of how is wealth redistributed and so on. As for the land question, the truth is that the apartheid regime led to 87% of the land being in the hands of of about 9 to 10% of the population, the white population. These are historical injustices of the past that have to be redressed. How you redress them, and the ruling party has taken two relevant resolutions to your question. The one is that land appropriation without compensation. And now they're working through the constitutional and the legal modalities of this to ensure that this is done in an orderly manner, that it doesn't impact on the economy in such a way that it destroys South Africa. As for the second resolution that was passed by the ruling party, the African National Congress, at its every 5 years, we have a national conference in December, was that South Africa should unconditionally and immediately downgrade its diplomatic relations with Israel. At the ground level, there's the South African population, I would say 99% of the South Africans recognize Israel as an apartheid state and identify with the Palestinians. And so does the ruling party. But the ruling party as a government has been very, very slow to act. We have withdrawn our ambassador from South Africa, from Tel Aviv. He is in South Africa. There are no, the ambassador did not return to South Africa. The ambassador, he went to fix family matters up. The Department of International Relations and Cooperation clarified this. Nothing had been restored with Israel. It is very unlikely. But the problem is that the resolution, and by the way, the resolution was a middle way between the call of the vast majority of conference, 5,000 delegates, to cut all ties with Israel, all ties. And the middle path, downgrade relations. And the resolution to downgrade relation with Israel was clearly stated, unconditional and immediate. Our government hasn't acted on this, and we're now launching a campaign against the government to make sure that it fulfills the no, I'm seeing the Times of Israel report. I'm familiar with it. I'm very familiar with it. It's completely untrue.
Time.
Yeah.
We have to move on. We have to move on.
Okay.
May I comment?
We got our third segment. We will get your comment, but we have to move on.
May I just address Sarah now, if I may? Professor, we have been talking about the role of Muslims in addressing the issues of sectarianism and nationalism in their different contexts, trying to stand against the hegemony, whether they are citizens in the United States or citizens in other countries. I want to address you as a scholar. Do you feel that there is a role that should be taken in hand by the scholars on Islam and Muslim world that is not at the moment very much so?
Sarah?
And after 9/11, some of the scholars of Islam and Islamic history have been under attack, that they were like sort of promoting a more positive understanding of Islam and Muslims, whether in history or in politics and society. So do you think that scholars need to do more regarding the situation now?
Is it on?
Yes.
Is it really? Can you hear? I think that scholars should always do more. I'm a historian in a department with one other person who works on Muslim societies. But I can't, I live in North Carolina. Our lives are very different than the lives of historians who live in New York and Washington. So I think I'm uniquely unqualified to answer your question.
Mm-hmm. Abdullah, what do you think, as a new generation?
I mean, I think for those of us who are sort of kind of emerging into the academy after many of these events and these developments that you're speaking about, I think that there has been a sense that I mean, there's been kind of two approaches, one of which, of course, is there was a desperation, and this was a purely, I would say, economically driven desperation on the part of, let's say, you know, the overall kind of Middle East and Islamic studies to sort of maintain their relevance as the kind of war on terror infrastructure was being built and developed and kind of sort of, you know, dispatched around the world. And of course, government funding is at the core of this, and there's been a lot, I think, that's been written on this that I think is really crucial, because I think, you know, when I was in graduate school, you would look around and you'd see that there's a lot of people, especially more toward the MA programs perhaps than the PhD programs, of people who were basically enlisting as part of this war on terror that was going to go global. And of course, they needed Arabic training, and they needed to understand the Arab mind, right? That this was part of an industry that was developing that was quite lucrative and couldn't be ignored. And at the same time, I think there was also a kind of a pushback coming the other way of people who felt even a greater responsibility to at least contribute to the developing discourse. And how to navigate that, I think, is an eternal question that I certainly can't claim to be able to answer. Because, you know, there are questions. We were just having this discussion a little bit at the end of lunch. You know, at what point do you want to be at the table when these kinds of discussions and debates are being had, is particularly for those who sort of, you know, coming from elite institutions, being based in a place like Washington, which gives you proximity to the people who are making these policies. Do you engage, or do you just sort of sit from your perch and kind of pontificate and give very principled positions, but not necessarily be in a position where you can actually affect immediate change, let's say? And I think that academia generally is structured in a way where has never really been an incentive, at least not within the academy itself, for affecting immediate policy change. It's about sort of shaping ideas that over time can have an impact, and sort of there's a kind of expectation of a trickle-down effect within society, within your students, within, you know, the overall shaping of culture and discourse.
Follow up on that, please. Just a small question regarding your generation and new changes. The American academia has been changing maps as well by opening sort of campuses outside America, and this is a new development. Did that, I mean, of course there was the American University in Cairo and in Beirut, but I mean, now we are having more and more campuses. Do you think that this, if we call it the periphery of the American academia, do you think that this might be a space of more freedom of thought, freedom of expression on the academic level?
I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, of course, there is a danger that these things could be implicated yet again in a sort of soft power diplomacy, if you will, or you can even perhaps characterize it in some capacity as a kind of a neo-imperial mission to expand American liberal academia in the heart of places that are seen as having rejected it, or that need to sort of come under the sway of this influence. And I think that danger exists, but again, academic institutions are made up of people. So despite whatever the founding mission may or may not be, you know, irrespective of what the people who sort of put pen to paper and come up with these agreements and then, of course, build the institutions themselves, in the end, they're managed by individuals, by faculty members, by scholars, by researchers. And I think in that sense, there is room certainly to be able to you know, perhaps have some kind of impact in the way that these discussions are playing out, and particularly for those who are specialists of the region, as opposed to people who are, you know, necessarily specialists in other regions that are then find themselves in the Middle East teaching about other places. I think they take that responsibility quite seriously in terms of how do we engage, you know, with the local surroundings in a way that perhaps gives agency and gives voice, as opposed to trying to kind of have a top-down imposition of certain values and ideals.
Very well. I need to move on. Hafsa has to catch a plane, so the next question is to her. And you will have 3 minutes, you know, basically to give your perspective. You know, you're a Kashmiri American. You grew up in the United States. You're a scholar now, and your dissertation had also touched on Kashmir and Kashmir history. So where do you see your role in advancing the issue of Kashmir as a scholar and also as somebody who cares deeply about the issue? Do you see any connection in light of what we have today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one, I mean, obviously my decision to join academia was because I felt very strongly about Kashmir. And at least from someone who was thinking about scholarship in the realm of ideas, I felt that the existing literature and the scholarship on Kashmir was either dominated by Indian nationalist narratives and scholarship or Pakistani-dominated nationalist narratives and scholarship. So there is now a small but growing group of Kashmiris themselves who are starting to own their own narratives, not just in scholarship, but also in terms of arts and literature. And I think that this movement, this kind of broader community, is going to play a really important role. One of the things that I always kind of do is think about Kashmir's connections with Palestine and thinking through Palestinian scholars and activists who were largely in the diaspora, Edward Said, of course, being a very obvious example, 40, 50 years ago. And Kashmiris haven't had that. I think only now are people actually being trained in institutions to speak out and have a much more international platform. And I think there will be some change that comes out of that, because once you own your own narrative and you don't allow others to speak for you, you can make more, you can make decisions and you can make recommendations and scholarship that actually helps the people and helps push certain narratives forward. The downside to that, though, is that all of us who work on Kashmir live in very precarious conditions, given the amount of surveillance and the kinds of things that the Indian state, but also at times the Pakistani state, imposes on what you can say and what you can do. So I always have this threat of, am I going to be allowed back in the next time I go? Like, what's going to happen to family? Things like that. And that's something that we all have to consider and navigate around. It doesn't mean I might give this talk, but I don't give this other talk. So it's something that all scholars, again, who have to deal with empire, have to deal with, but it's somewhat positive to know that there are other people who are in the same boat, and you know, we're kind of all working towards similar ends or similar goals.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you have any response to what, or comments on what Professor Ishaq said?
What Fareed said? Yeah, I mean, it was slanderous. Completely joking. I mean, in a way, I agree in less, maybe less combative terms. I mean, I would say that I think the United States is at its best when it is not trying to exert power in other countries. I mean, it's sort of, it's ironic that I think one of the reasons that people like Trump, you know, America's always had this isolationist trend, and it's kind of conservative isolationism, and I think some people get really upset about that when you think about Trump. But I mean, I'd hate to say it, but I feel that myself. I mean, I want to minimize the number of people who want to kill me or my family. That's one thing. And usually United States involvement overseas causes enmity and danger. And then, you know, you just see the destruction of places like Yemen, or, you know, you could just point to any number of places historically in Central America, the number of people who've died because of you know, some obscure application of a U.S. foreign policy. And I mean, I think, yeah, I'd be much happier if it were more of a, you know, republic, Jeffersonian agrarian republic or something, as opposed to this country that had interests all over the place and was willing to spill blood to pursue them.
Sarah, how do you see the role of historian? What is the role of the historian in your view? Especially someone who is sitting in the midst of an empire.
A historian in the midst of the empire.
Yes.
I think the project of a historian is to challenge the dominant narrative. I mean, then that's a really easy phrase. But I was just talking with somebody who is trying to figure out how to get the stories of people whose voices haven't been heard in Kashmir. And we talked about what sorts of questions and why it's so important for new narratives to be out there, not only for restorative justice, and I don't know how you feel about that, but the stories that we tell about ourselves and each other determine how we behave in the world. Americans don't think of ourselves as living in the center of empire. And if we knew more as historians, then we would, which would hopefully mean that Americans would either say that they're really comfortable being at the center of empire, or they would try to make changes.
Especially that 90% of the people own only 20% of the wealth, and you have 10% owning almost 50% of the wealth. So these are the real beneficiaries of the empire, and most people don't know.
And Americans, all Americans are beneficiaries of the empire compared with the people that we subjugate around the world. But most Americans don't know that story. And that's one of the big jobs for historians.
What do you think, Joseph?
I don't think it's about ignorance, although it's part of it. I mean, I usually ask my students, I teach at an elite institution in New York, the children of the rich, mostly white children of the rich, come to my very expensive and elite university.
Thank you so much, Hafsa. Safe travel.
And so, you know, usually American educational institutions, the American media, the way the American government discourse emphasize a kind of a mythical propaganda line which tells us that the US has been a democracy since 1776. So I usually ask my students, do you think this is a democracy, or it's been a democracy since the beginning?
Is it on?
Is it not on?
Now on.
Now it's on. So I ask my students, you know, who come from well-educated families and rich families, if they think their country has been a democracy since its inception, and they usually say yes. So I ask, did you not know that the first century was a century of slavery? Oh, no, we did. Did you not know that the second century was a century of apartheid? Oh, we do. Do you not know that the first 150 years women did not have the right to vote? We know. Did you not know that the first 50 years only property-owning white men could vote? We know. So do you realize that when you say it's been a democracy since 1776, you are a white male supremacist? And they don't know what to say. Then the response, so usually they know these things. You see, it's not hidden from them that there was a century of slavery followed by a century of apartheid. Yet the dominant and hegemonic understanding of their history remains one of a democracy. Often they would say, well, it's an evolutionary democracy. So I give a counter-example. Would you accept a white supremacist South African telling us that their country was founded in 1910 as a democracy, and it evolved in 1983 with a tricameral parliament, and in 1994 black people also got the vote. So, however, it's been a democracy since 1910. And of course they laugh, because if a South African would make that argument, they would be laughed out of the room immediately. Yet an equivalent American can make it, you know, with complete abandon. So,
and what do you think that is? Is it the media?
I think there's a hegemony of this apocryphal sort of view of themselves as a democratic country.
But structurally, how were they able to convince the average American that
I think schools, the universities, as well as the media, but also a predominant government discourse, which tells them as long as white men had the vote, that is actually a democracy. And of course, it was a democracy for white property-owning men for 250 years, but not for the rest of Americans. So I do think that hegemony does not prevent them from knowing the truth, but it does shield them from the impact of that truth on the judgment they make on the system within which they live.
Now, I will start from, I will pick on the notion of judgment, and I will move to the notion of imagination. So, Abdullah, I heard that you are doing now research on the changing and hybrid nature of concepts, and how we for a long time separated between Islamism and nationalism, seeing them as two different things and sometimes opposing each other. And I understand that you are now studying different cases of Islamic movements as having a very heavy nationalist component in their understanding and imagination. So can you elaborate on that so that we can see these notions in motion rather than static categories?
Sure. This was a presentation I think I gave at this conference last year, in which I basically laid out the arguments for an upcoming book project that is trying to rethink Islamism as kind of subsuming it within the overall nationalist histories of the Arab Middle East in particular. And I take 6 different case studies in which I'm essentially asking the question of, were these Islamists? And in particular, I'm looking at brotherhood movements. So the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course is founded in a very specific context in interwar Egypt, at a time of immense, of course, change in Arab influx, in which, of course, you see the fall of the caliphate and the emergence of a very strong and decidedly nationalist movement, notwithstanding some of the critiques of those early nationalist movements that we heard today. But that ultimately results in a nation state in Egypt. And then, of course, that movement is exported from the opposition, the kind of Islamist opposition that emerges in Egypt. You see, I made the case that I don't think that Hassan al-Banna's mission was necessarily rejecting the nation-state model. It was highly critical of it. It was critical of the way that it was being envisioned and interpreted by decidedly, perhaps secular is harsh, but secular forces within society, or at least forces that wanted to subsume religion or kind of give it a much lesser, lower status in the emerging political, socio-economic orders. And he simply just wanted to elevate the place of Islam, but ultimately accepted the logic of the nation state and the structures within. We know, of course, he ran for parliament and encouraged his followers to do so, accepted the emerging political arrangements that were being done. And then when you see the way that the Brotherhood movement then gets transmitted transnationally and spreads across the Arab world, there is a sense that, yes, this is a movement to unite the Muslim Ummah. We've heard this basically from that moment all the way through 2011, right? That people talked about an Islamist winter following the Arab Spring, one in which they would try to bring back the caliphate from Morocco to Yemen. Interesting that I don't think there's ever been a caliphate that's actually existed, particularly within those borders. This was something that was very much invented as a kind of mapping it onto a kind of a pan-Arab, except it's a pan-Arab Islamist sort of vision. But when you actually talk to these parties and you look at their histories, none of them were ever actually talking about this. And beyond the kind of very cursory rhetoric, when you look at their actual interactions, when you look at their programs, when you look at the way that they adapted and evolved internally, you can map it on almost completely with what was happening domestically within the sort of the emergence of national political orders. And so I trace this, for instance, in Sudan, where you look at the experience of Hassan al-Turabi, who, of course, immediately abandons the name of Muslim Brotherhood, adopts something slightly different, and then, of course, weds his mission to state power almost immediately. And in fact, no one really looks at the example of Sudan and the experience both in the 70s and then later in the 90s of Islamists sort of in power. We tend to think, well, when Mohamed Morsi was elected in 2011, that's the first Islamist coming to power, when in fact we have other examples that precede that even within the Arab world. And the book sort of continues on with other cases. We look at Jordan, Syria, the Palestinian context, Kuwait, and then it concludes with Tunisia, because I argue that the Tunisian model, so to speak, the Nahda model, is the one that I think has completely signaled its acceptance and its kind of enlistment in not just the nation-state project, but a particular model of the nation-state that is kind of rooted in this liberal system of values. And that this was a calculation that I think all of these movements have made in order to survive, right? That the only way to survive the state is in order to essentially surrender to it. And whether you do so as a result of pragmatism or whether this eventually becomes ideologically internalized almost makes no difference. It's almost a kind of a immaterial argument, but ultimately in the end they've done so.
Can I take the discussion to Professor Mas'ad and ask him, can we draw parallels with the leftist movement? Because we have been attacking liberalism with all the good reasons for that, but can we look also at the leftist movement, at the Marxists in the Arab world, and to which extent they actually contributed to the situation we are in now?
Well, it's kind of hard to say much about them now because there are very, very little leftist forces, secular or Islamist, left with a major impact on any state in the region. But of course, they have had larger impact historically, and it depends on sort of which left, in the sense of many parties that claim to be somehow leftist, say like the Ba'ath Party, ended up being quite right-wing in many ways, and other ways left-wing. So, the Ba'athist parties were as anti-communist in their rhetoric and actions against local communist parties as had been fascist parties, right? The crackdown, say, on the Iraqi Communist Party in 1963, and the murder of upwards of thousands of communists at that time on CIA CIA orders, or at least with the CIA providing addresses for communists. So in that sense, we have different kinds of leftist movements. So the most leftist, of course, at least on the traditional political spectrum, would be communist parties, as in Sudan or Iraq, both of which were ultimately destroyed, versus leftist regimes like the Nasser regime, let's say, and the Communist Party of Egypt, as we know, surrendered to the Nasser regime and dissolved itself in the early 60s. But, you know, or versus the different kinds of Ba'ath regimes in Syria or in Iraq. For example, Salah Jadid in Syria between 65 and 70 had a very, or 66 and 70, had a very different, say, regime, and perhaps an ultra-secularist anti-religion attitude versus the subsequent regime. And in Iraq, there was not necessarily anti-religion, but there was a secularizing aspect, for example, in changing certain laws of polygamy and what have you under Saddam Hussein. Nonetheless, I think there's a general political culture of, or leftist cultural and liberationist movement that arose in the Arab world, especially the Palestinians and the Algerians, who gave it a much more different meaning than the regimes had done, although, of course, after the institutionalization of the Algerian regime, things had changed, and we saw how the PLO was transformed from a liberation group into a subcontractor for colonialism and the occupation. So a lot of this, of course, had changed after 67. The defeat of 67 affected majorly the rhetoric of leftist movements on understanding the problems of the Arab world as being problems of development, the problems of capitalism, not terribly sensitive to the question of religion, except culturally. They were interested in redrawing the history of the Arab world and even looking at Islam in revolutionary ways. After all, even someone as the founder of the Ba'ath Party, Michel Aflaq, saw a very important historical part of Islam in his revolutionary rhetoric. So in that sense, they didn't abandon the importance of Islam as the history of the region and as perhaps an inspiration for revolutionary action in the future, but in many of their policies they wanted to downgrade the importance of faith and religion. And I think this was in some ways to their detriment, but definitely the defeat of Arab leftist forces happened in 67 to 1970. This was the period in which they were defeated on the ground in the battle with Israel, but also ideologically by seeing much of what they supported or they called for either not coming to fruition or the extent to which it did being dismantled. So as a result, what we have, most of these forces were transformed into either liberal or right-wing forces since then, whether on the secular side or on the Islamist side. So we don't see the voice of leftist Islamists or secularists predominate today. They continue, but they don't predominate in political movements. They don't get the support or the funding, which Abdullah had spoken about. And I think in that sense there has to be a complete reconceptualization of that project to include economic justice. So economic justice is the part that defined the left historically and is the part that is completely absent from most of the predominant movements today on either the Islamist or the secular side.
Chantal Mouffe just published 3 months ago, almost. Chantal Mouffe published a book about how we can reclaim progressive discourses to a more populist level. And I might move to Farid Ishaq. How do you see the future of what we, at a specific point, used to call progressive Islam? I mean, do you find that, because what I see, especially amongst the youth, there is a sense of irony, a rising sense of irony. There is nothing more ideological that is making them become more passionate, especially after the fall or the crisis of the Arab Spring. A lot of youth now are feeling like nothing really makes any sense anymore. So do you think that this might be a window for a progressive discourse to enter the realm of thinking now, or it might be useful to think on different other levels?
I try to kind of avoid the use of the word progressive, although I understand what you mean by that. I think that I think despite, and this is one of the questions I've raised with Professor Massad, despite our critique of the way in which many of the liberals, the modernists, what I had earlier on in my own talk described as the progressives, I think despite our critique of where they come from, where they are funded, the larger agenda and so on, that they do address issues, whatever the inadequacies, that are real. Now these issues are captured, they are manipulated, they are distorted, but they are, I mean, the issues, for example, of, say, gender violence. It's not a Muslim issue, but it's not an issue that is absent inside Muslim societies. Our challenge is, how do we speak to the real, and here's a difficult word, the conditions of Muslims, and not manufactured conditions. I mean, for example, Professor Masad speaks about the economic conditions of people. Now, that's not a problem that receives headlines or prominence. It's not sexy. Economic disparities, poverty, the struggle to match what is in your pocket with the prices that are in the shop. Those aren't real in terms of what makes the headlines. So our challenge, I think, is to be engaged with those real issues. And for me, I mean, I spoke to Professor Lombard about this during lunch. The question, for example, of, say, the stigmatization of people living with sexually transmitted diseases. When in the question of HIV and AIDS, I mean, the vast majority of women in a country like India or in South Africa actually contracted it inside marriage. So what do we say religiously to those whether social issues or economic issues? How do we speak theologically to those real issues amongst people? And I do think that this largely depends on how the thinker or the theologian sees his or her location. If you are located entirely inside the academy, and the academy is wedded to the urgencies of publishing or the urgencies of the empire, then you have to address questions about why is Islam is actually a peaceful religion? Why is Islam actually a moderate religion? When you come from the global south and you internalize the concerns of the global south, your issues is, what does Islam say about access to drinking water? What does Islam say about how health is privatized? So I do think that there is a lot of space for us to wed the genuine concerns of our communities with struggling to connect this with our own religious heritages. And here I must say, I'm becoming increasingly a fan of the decolonial project. The one inadequate part of that project is we're not very good at working out what is our alternative vision. And so it's fine to critique the epistemological qibla or the financial qibla of the world, which is now either this university with its satellite campus here or actually in Washington, D.C. or New York. It's fine to criticize these qiblas. But what is not only, we may have an idea of where our qibla ought to be, but what is our manhaj and what are the details of this alternative vision? But I do think that from this dissatisfaction with what is appearing as the American moment, that it does have the germs for people to begin to search.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sarah, this question is for you, but I would like also to hear everybody on the panel. All of you are academics, university professors. You've faced some challenges. And if you have a story that you can share with us when you taught something and you had resistance either from the students or the administration, is because you were teaching something that was not normative. It was not something that people accepted, especially when it comes to the Arab-Israeli issue. Or tell us some of the pressures that you have to face as an academic or have faced throughout your academic life.
I live a privileged experience as an academic. I live in North Carolina, where there is not a Zionist lobby. It is fine for me to be a BDS supporter. I've never been told that I can't do anything as a result of that. I've been challenged. I have a following whenever I go talk to public audiences, which is very frequent. I have a local Zionist following who always asks the same questions. Mostly what I get from students is ignorance and not hostility. Our big problems in the South have to do with race rather than religion. Someone who is black and Muslim is targeted because they're black, not because they're Muslim. North Carolina, of course, is where I had a friend assassinated because he was Muslim, along with his wife and his sister-in-law. So we're dealing with violence and racial issues that come into the classroom but are so obvious that I don't think I have the kinds of issues that other people are dealing with. My students know that I'm a Jew and a BDS supporter. I think that gives me a bit more credibility when I talk about Palestine. But the biggest problems I had were when I was teaching down the road at Duke, because the students there were so entitled that, North Carolina students tend to be first generation, some of them immigrants. It's a different environment. And I have to say that I hardly ever get real hostility except from, some of the people in these audiences who try to get me fired.
I should have stayed there.
What?
I should have stayed there.
Well...
Instead of going to Florida.
I don't know that I have much anything useful necessarily to add. I think I'm in a pretty unique situation, as I guess some of you know, being in a place like Qatar, but at an American satellite campus there. But one of the just fascinating observations for me has been being in a very international place. I think out of 300 students, we have something like 60 nationalities, mostly coming from across the Arab world. And one of the interesting things that's sort of a kind of a byproduct of bringing in a collection of students largely from the region is there's a certain sense of ownership over their own national histories and national questions. So that, if you're teaching even just a broad Middle East survey, there's a sense that, while the Syrian students are more entitled to speak about anything Syria related, and the same for the Jordanians, and the same for the Lebanese, and of course the Egyptians, no one is allowed to touch, the history of Egypt. So I think that's something that's been interesting to see how deeply the sense of a kind of a national identity has been so deeply ingrained, even among so-called millennials, even among a kind of a generation that's supposed to be third culture, that there's still that kind of sense of a deep rootedness of a kind of national identity, even to the point that within an academic setting where everyone should be free to read and discuss and engage freely without having some sort of predetermined authority that comes on the basis of sort of who your parents were, where they were born.
Do they become humble at the end of the course?
I don't want to be too hard, because I think ultimately it's an incredibly uplifting experience, but these are just sort of one of the interesting kinds of observations that I've made in that time.
Jack?
Well, I would say actually my experience has been good because, I started noticing when I moved to Georgetown, which was 2010, that, when I was a student at Georgetown, an undergraduate, and, if someone said something critical of Israel in class and I was in college, it was like the room just became totally silent. It was as if you had said, something just the most unimaginable thing.
Blasphemous.
And now, ever since I moved to Georgetown in 2010, so every year, it's just freshman class, first semester, freshman year, 15 students get stuck in this class. And so it's, they don't know who I am, they don't know what their views, it's not a class you take if you like Muslims or Islam or something like that. But every time people bring up Israel, actually, I have to, if there's a student who's defending Israel, I actually have to protect that student from the other students. Yeah, just this year, maybe a month ago, we were talking about trying to define the West and what's the West, and someone brought up the idea of Israel, and is Israel the West? And they said, Israel's a democracy. And then all these other students just pounced on the person. And I mean, I had to kind of be like, no, I think I understand what he's trying to say. And because they basically were, it was like watching, it would be like how people would talk about South Africa in like 1995 or something like that in the U.S. I mean, when, you know, apartheid was the ultimate evil and Lethal Weapon 2 had come out and stuff like that. Remember Lethal Weapon 2? There was South African white guy was the bad guy.
So you see hope in American?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't. It's sort of a limited world that I inhabit, but I mean, I certainly, the change has been, from when I was in college, has been at one university. You know, it has been huge. I mean, almost 180 degrees.
Well, no, I mean, I teach a kind of an interesting course called Palestinian and Israeli Politics and Societies, which I've taught for now about 18 years, and it got me in trouble. I almost lost my job as a result of it. But it's an interesting course because what I do is not a kind of diplomatic history, but rather a kind of ideology critique. And in many ways, so I begin with the history of European Christian Zionism. We begin sort of with the Renaissance and the Protestant movement, and then with anti-Semitism. And I very much present Zionism historically, as many critics, Jewish critics of Zionism and historians have done, as part of an anti-Semitic rhetoric against Jews. So in many ways, Zionism is presented as having been a minority movement within Jewish communities, opposed by Jews for a long time, and that in many ways espouses anti-Semitic views. Many of my students, of course, are of Jewish background. I live in New York, so this reflects the demographics. But I also have a lot of students that issue from Muslim or Arab families who are also interested. In many ways, of course, I have also seen a large change. I mean, even when I was attacked by forces outside the university, which collaborated with the administration of my university to try to get me kicked out, the people who actually defended me the most were my Jewish colleagues and many of my Jewish students. The people who did not defend me as much were my so-called Arab colleagues, or especially those who are claimants to Palestinianness, who claim to be Palestinian colleagues. So it's very interesting to me sort of how, you know, this has changed over the years. And increasingly, of course, now when I get invited to speak by student groups rather than by faculty, many of the student groups who want to invite me to speak on Palestine, now I see in the last sort of 10 years or so, sometimes led by Jewish students, if not predominantly composed of them. So there's a huge difference now in the Jewish community, in the new generation of the Jewish community on the question of Israel and Palestine, and they see these differences. Now, one of the issues that came up often when I taught this course that the administration wanted me to address, the university administration, was the question of balance. And I kept saying, I don't understand. If I'm teaching a class on sexism, for example, I don't have to teach the sexist point of view and the feminist point of view. If I have to teach a class on the history of Nazism, I don't have to teach the Nazi point of view and the anti-Nazi point of view, or a class on slavery, or on Stalin. That none of these kinds of courses require me to have any kind of balance. But of course, the idea is that these ideological struggles have been settled in the mainstream, whereas the Palestinian issue has not, and therefore they wanted me to provide balance. And I said, my balance is, and I'm equally critical of Zionism as I am of Palestinian nationalism. But that's all I can do. It's an ideology critique kind of course. So for the most part, it remains a popular course. I still get harassed sometimes by some students, usually dispatched by some group from outside. But for the most part, often now, I do have to defend some students who articulate a very strong pro-Israeli position to make sure that they are protected from, being pounced on, as you put it, and I make sure that they're able to actually defend themselves and their arguments as others would. So that's my role as a professor.
Dr. Ezzat.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I may want to just pass the question of Palestine. My university is the first university and one of only 3 universities in the world that have taken university decisions, meaning by the governing boards of the university. Ours was the first to cut off ties with all Israeli universities, because these Israeli universities are complicit in apartheid. And in our university, this was a vote in our Senate, by 72% of the Senate. And I think 9% of the Senate was opposed to this vote. This happened about 7 years ago. About 6 or 7%, 9%, I'm not quite sure about the percent that supported, that was opposed to the motion. And the only argument against the motion was academic freedom. There wasn't a single voice in our university in support of Israel or in support of Zionism. So, alhamdulillah, that is the kind of university environment in South Africa in general. So this is not an issue. There is a strong Zionist lobby that has particular difficulties with me because I have written extensively about Muslim anti-Semitism, and I've condemned it. And the one fascinating thing about BDS in South Africa is we actually have a Holocaust Memorial Day, where we talk about the Nazi Holocaust, not just so, and it's kind of very genuine, drawing attention to it and so on. So I don't have any of those issues. One of the issues that I do want to share, as an academic that I have, is often the tensions in being the expectations of so-called objective critical scholarship on the one hand, and my own commitment as an engaged believer. And being an engaged believer means that I'm engaged with my community, with real Muslims, and that I am engaged with my texts that I own. And so there are often, so that's one kind of serious tension that I experience, that I take seriously and grapple with. The one other tension that I grapple with as an academic is I often don't know, whether I'm an activist masquerading as an academic or whether I'm an academic masquerading as an activist. Earlier on, when you introduced this panel, you spoke about scholars. And then I looked at these people. And then oh gosh, no, Farid, he's also talking about you. Yes, he is talking about you also. So, and so I kind of think of myself as a bit of a charlatan. And it's something that many academics are saddled with. I'm one of those people riddled with it. I'm kind of trying my luck, but I'm going to get caught out one day. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is the tensions between how do I push my believing students into more critical thinking, and how do I push my more committed religious people into also valuing appreciating the contribution of being critical and looking at things from a different side. But finally, I think of myself as a practicing academic and as a practicing Muslim. Practicing as in I'm practicing to be. I'm not. So I'm practicing to be, and sometimes I'm lazy with my practicing to be, and sometimes I'm more energetic. But so I'm a practicing academic, and I'm a practicing Muslim in the apprentice sense of the word.
Thank you very much. We'll transform. Yes, please.
We don't have a big problem with Zionists in North Carolina, but we are full of military bases. And so when I encounter the activism scholar issue, it's talking about preventing war in Iraq, trying to avoid war in Iraq, the consequences of war in Iraq, when my students' parents have been involved in those conflicts. So taking a position opposed to a new invasion of Iran, a former invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq, if I take a strong enough activist position, and I do think of myself as an activist, then I'm accused of not being an objective scholar. So it's the military, the U.S. empire itself. I'm in the middle of the U.S. empire, even though I'm not in D.C. And so those activist, academic things come back to haunt me sometimes.
Thank you so much. I'm glad and pleased that we're transforming the philosopher king into academic activists. So that's great. Please thank for me everybody that here on the stage. They've been wonderful, and they have shared with us their thoughts and as well as their experiences. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for participating. It's been great. That was wonderful. Our next panel actually will start in 5 minutes. So if you'd like to stretch out, but please don't go outside. So stay here so we can start right away. Dr. Mehmet Bulut, Dr. Ahmed Musalli, Dr. Francois Bourga, Dr. Luay Safi, Dr. Joseph Lombard, Dr. Shinek Akturk, and Dr. Nagihan Khalilulu.